there was a very, there was actually a remarkable event that took place on April 9th of this year when Mort Klein gave really landmark congressional testimony summarizing important data on the prevalence of anti-Semitism. He's pictured here holding up a summary slide from the Anti-Defamation League showing how globally Muslims versus other religions exhibit a 2 to 3-fold excess prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism, and we'll go over these data at some length. And also pictured is Grand Imam al-Azhar on the left, who you're already familiar with, and the current Grand Imam, Tantawi's successor, Ahmed al-Tayeb. And we'll talk about both of them in terms of Islamic anti-Semitism. This is just to give you an example of the current or most recent ADL questionnaire that's used to assess the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism. So you can see these anti-Semitic statements that people queried are asked to agree with or disagree with. And if they agree with at least 6 of these anti-Semitic stereotypes, they're considered an index case of extreme anti-Semitism. So we can see it's a very specific instrument, but it's picking up extreme anti-Semitism. So if you agree with 1 or 2 or 4 of these, it wouldn't detect you. So it's not a particularly sensitive instrument. One could argue that believing any of these things already defines you as a case of anti-Semitism, but the instrument is designed to pick up extreme anti-Semitism. I would point out number 11, Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars, might resonate particularly with Muslims, since the Quran teaches that Jews are spreaders of discord and corruption in the 5th surah in 2 verses, verses 532 to 33, and also verse 564. So in summary, once the ADL applied this scale in its series of surveys, which ranged from 2014 to early 2017. So in 2014, they did the major survey of 100 countries worldwide. In 2015, they moved to Western Europe and oversampled the Muslim population there. And in 2016, late 2016 to early 2017, they finally reached the United States and applied this instrument in the United States. So overall, there was a 2 to 4.5-fold excess of Muslim Jew hatred relative to any other major religious affiliation or atheism, agnosticism. And this association with Islam persisted within the Muslim diaspora populations of both Western Europe and the United States. The world's 16 most anti-Semitic countries were all in the Muslim Middle East, where 74 to 93% exhibited extreme anti-Semitism. The prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism globally by religious affiliation, again, these were the data that Mort Klein was holding up on that display board, was Muslims 49%, Christians 24%, no religion 21%, Hindus 19%, Buddhists 17%. Again, reflective of this at least 2-fold excess of extreme anti-Semitism amongst Muslims. In Western Europe, the overall prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism within the Muslim communities was between 49 to 68% versus 12 to 29% amongst non-Muslims. Again, this consistent 2 to 4.5-fold excess in the individual countries, the worst being Belgium with 68%. In the U.S., much more philo-Semitic country, the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism already in this country is rather alarming at 34% within the Muslim community versus 14% of the general population. A 2.4-fold excess, again, at lower levels overall, but generally consistent with the global trends of at least a 2-fold excess in Muslims versus non-Muslims. This is breaking down the world's 16 worst countries. These are all countries, and we need to bear this in mind for a later mention in the discussion that came up of how the ADL reacted to Mort Klein's discussion of their own data. But look at these data, and these are countries that are 90 to 100% Muslim countries, with the exception of Lebanon, which has evolved into a Muslim majority nation where at least 60% of the Lebanese population, based on more recent surveys, is now Muslim. So now I want to drill down a little bit on Muhammad Sayyid Tantawi and his, what I have called his modern Quranic Kampf on the Jews. Again, he was the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, Sunni Islam's Vatican equivalent for religious education, and the Grand Imam being the papal equivalent. From 1996 to 2010, he was the Grand Imam. He is arguably, again, the leading modern Sunni Quranic commentator. He edited a full 15-volume Quran commentary. He also helped establish the largest online resource for Quranic interpretation at altafsir.com, which has published approximately 100 full-text, verse-by-verse searchable classical and modern commentaries on the Quran, including his own. Earlier, as a student at Al-Azhar University, and by the way, he was a hafiz as a young person, which means a person often young who memorizes the entire Quran. So he was sort of destined for this path of Quranic studies, as it turns out. But as a PhD, he wrote something that translates in English as his Al-Azhar University PhD, Jews in the Quran and Traditions. And I had major extracts from this 700-page treatise translated for my book, The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism. And I can tell you that the extract presented here is very, very consistent with this entire dreary, virulently anti-Semitic work. So, the Quran, in Tantawi's words, the Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, i.e. killing the prophets of Allah, that's Quran 261, 3:112, it's repeated elsewhere, corrupting his words by putting them in the wrong places, Quran 4:46, consuming the people's wealth frivolously, Quran 4:161, refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do, Quran 3:120 and 579, and other ugly characteristics caused by their deep-rooted lascivious envy, Quran 2:109. Only a minority of the Jews keep their word. All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims. Again, we've heard that theme before, Quran 3:113. The bad ones do not. The Jews always remain maleficent deniers. They should desist from their negative denial. Some Jews went way overboard in their denying hostility. So gentle persuasion can do no good with them. So use force with them and treat them in the way you see as effective in ridding them of their evil. One may go so far as to ban their religion, their persons, their wealth, and their villages. So what's truly odious here is that you essentially see a rationale for violence against Jews, written. He's a younger person at this point, but written by a man destined to become the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, and we'll reflect back on his feelings about this particular PhD thesis and its conclusions roughly 30 years after he wrote it. I also wanted to mention that these litanies of negative traits of Jews are a stock in trade now from Al-Azhar University going back to 1968. During Tantawi's tenure, one was published by his colleague and a one-time head of the Religious Edict or Fatwa Committee, Sheikh Sakhr, entitled straightforwardly, Jews' 20 Bad Traits as Described in the Quran. Continuing with Tantawi, so if we were to argue that the PhD thesis, which I just read sort of a very typical extract from, was an immature work, the same cannot be said of his Tantawi's full Quranic commentary. It includes, for example, this gloss on Quran 560, the Jews as apes and pigs verse, which condemns in broad terms, quote, the corrupt thinking and false assumption and claims of the Jews, and further maintains generally what you, the Jews, claim is even more evil, as shown in the penalty that has befallen you as you have been cursed and become estranged from Allah's mercy and compassion, and what has befallen your ancestors, of whom some were transformed into apes, others into pigs. As Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Tantawi issued a hostile statement on interfaith dialogue shortly after he met with Israel's chief rabbi, Israel Meir Lau, in Cairo on December 15, 1997. which also included, importantly, a reaffirmation of the views he expressed in his PhD dissertation, i.e. Jews in the Quran and the traditions. Here's what he said at the time. The Prophet's stance, which is my own stance as well, was that anyone who avoids meeting with the enemies in order to counter their dubious claims and stick fingers into their eyes is a coward. My stance stems from Allah's book, the Quran, more than 1/3 of which deals with the Jews. That's true. I wrote a dissertation dealing with them, the Jews, all their false claims and their punishment by Allah. I still believe in everything written in that dissertation. So Tantawi's dissertation was completed in 1966. It was published in 1968. So here he is 30 years later reaffirming everything that was in it. And more ominously, apparently unmoved, even after the Netanya carnage, this homicide bombing during Passover and great massacre of Jews on March 27, 2002, Tantawi in April 2002, after that massacre, proclaimed the legitimacy of homicide bombing of Jews and condemned the Jews as enemies of Allah, descendants of apes and pigs, per Quran 560, making just unmistakable his personal, religiously sanctioned Muslim Jew hatred, making it eminently clear. This is a discussion, briefly, of Tantawi's successor, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, who succeeded Tantawi, who, by the way, died apparently of a myocardial infarction, of a heart attack, suddenly in March of 2010. And he was succeeded by Ahmed Al-Tayeb, who still remains currently the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University. In 2017, a yearly publication, and we'll elaborate on this a little bit, but basically it's put out by the Al-Bayt Institute of Islamic Thought, organizations which are Jordanian institutions that represent mainstream Islam, heavily involved in interfaith dialogue, really achieved some prominence in the aftermath of Pope Benedict's Regensburg address, which, of course, in discussing the jihad depredations of Islam against Christianity during the Middle Ages and rooting it in Muhammad's behavior, evoked a lot of outrage. It was based on the medieval Christian-Muslim polemic. But regardless, that think tank is very much in the mainstream. And he was, every year they rank the most influential 500 Muslims in the world. It comes out, it's called the Muslim 500. Al-Tayeb, the current Grand Imam, was number 1 in 2017 recently. And his profile states, influence, highest scholarly authority for the majority of Sunni Muslims, runs the foremost and largest Sunni Islamic university, being Al-Azhar University, school of thought, traditional Sunni. So Al-Tayeb gave an interview on Egyptian TV, which aired October 25th, 2013, and he gave a brief explanation of the ongoing relevance of the Quranic verse 582, which really has been invoked to inspire violent Muslim hatred of Jews since the advent of Islam. Indeed, you can see a treatise written in the middle of the 9th century by a polymath, Al-Jahiz, who was commissioned actually to write an anti-Christian polemic because the Muslim caliph at the time, Al-Mutawakkil, noticed that the Muslim attitudes were more negative towards Jews than they were towards Christians. And remember, in the mid-19th century, in mid-9th century Iraq, that was a disadvantage for a Muslim caliph because he had bordering communities that were Christian communities that were still very powerful and hostile, and he did not want his population to harbor greater enmity towards Jews than Christians. In studying why this phenomenon was, he commissioned Al-Jahiz, and Al-Jahiz noted that the reason that the Jews were more despised by the Muslims was because of this Quranic verse and other theological negative references about the Jews' interactions with Muhammad. At any event, during this 2013 interview, Muhammad Al-Tayeb invoked this verse to show that this stance of hatred towards Jews was still prevalent and justified by this verse. and he made an open equivalence of Jews and Zionists and Judaism and Zionism. And here's what he said verbatim. A verse in the Quran, 582, explains the Muslims' relations with Jews. This is an historical perspective which has not changed to this day. See how we suffer today from global Zionism and Judaism. Since the inception of Islam 1400 years ago, we have been suffering from Jews and Zionist interference in Muslim affairs. This is a cause of great distress for the Muslims. The Quran said it, and history has proven it, and he's here now quoting from this verse, Quran 582. You shall find the strongest among men in enmity to the believers, the Muslims, to be the Jews. Now, at the time, I wrote about this and how there was no outcry, no denunciation from Jewish or other religious, non-Muslim religious communal leaders, politicians, etc. I happened to write to Geert Wilders, who I know personally, and he became the only politician, indeed the only public figure of stature, to condemn Tayyip's remarks, and he urged Pope Francis to condemn them, of course, to no avail. Continuing with Al-Tayyib, twice in 2014 and 2015, he blamed global Zionism and its machinations for the proliferation of jihad terror in the Middle East, including ISIS. In January of 2018, Al-Tayyib blamed, quote, the Zionist claimed that the Zionist entity was plotting to march on the Meccan Kaaba, that structure in Mecca around which you see the Hajj pilgrims navigating around it, and the Jews, the Zionist entity, was also planning on attacking the mosque of Islam's prophet in Medina. Finally, during June 2018, after notwithstanding all these very anti-Semitic statements he'd made, he declared that the issue of anti-Semitism is a lie that continues to deceive nations to this day. So these are the words of the current Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University. Again, the papal equivalent of Sunni Islam's Vatican equivalent. Another point that came up in the discussion was how the Anti-Defamation League interpreted their own data in response to Mort Klein's landmark April 9th, 2019 congressional testimony at the same hearing. So, as was demonstrated during the presentation, one of the pieces of data that Mort presented was, and these are all ADL's own data, that the 16 countries with the highest index scores of anti-Semitism. Again, remember, this is the prevalence of at least agreeing with at least 6 out of 11 clearly anti-Semitic tropes or stereotypes. So, unsurprisingly, the West Bank and Gaza had the highest prevalence, but strikingly high prevalence in all 16 of the countries listed, from a low of 74% to 92 and 93% in the West Bank and Iraq. So extraordinarily high rates of extreme anti-Semitism. I pointed out that in response to Klein's presentation of ADL data, such as those illustrating the 16 countries with the highest prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism, and again, all of them Arab Muslim societies whose populations are 90 to 100% Muslims. The lone exception being Lebanon, which is at least now a 60% Muslim majority country. ADL's Eileen Hershenov, Senior Vice President for Policy, and she's illustrated below, had the temerity to portray the virulently anti-Semitic Muslim denizens of these countries. She said in response to Mort's testimony before hers, quote, one of the witnesses, Klein, talked about global attitudes that we look at, and the ADL does track that. Vulnerable, marginalized communities have bigotry within them.
One of the witnesses talked about the global attitudes that we look at. That's nonviolent, looking at attitudes, and the ADL does track that. We feel it is incumbent, vulnerable, marginalized communities have bigotry within them.
So in other words, Ms. Hershenov was was dismissing away, hand waving away these virulently anti-Semitic attitudes by grotesquely mischaracterizing these countries as having vulnerable, marginalized Muslim communities in them.